This is a presentation to go along with Chapter 39. It's a brief presentation covering the Vietnam War. And again, I'll just touch on a couple of themes. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but this goes along with Chapter 39 in the American pageant. And a reminder that the images within this presentation are in the public domain. I would also like to call your attention to the American Experience channel and also PBS channel. There's a wealth of information at this website. So please, if you are interested in pursuing any more detail about any of the subjects that I cover, please go to those websites and do some research on your own. So we're going to start off with a little bit of background for Vietnam and call your attention to the fact that Vietnam, the French Indochina, had been colonized. It had been controlled by the imperialism of Europe as early as 1883. Nationalist feelings were strong in Vietnam. There's a communist movement led by Ho Chi Minh, but the main movement is for independence and a feeling that no colonial powers should control the country. So shortly, during and shortly after World War II, Ho Chi Minh, as the French are defeated by the Germans initially in World War II, as Hitler walks through France and defeats France, Ho Chi Minh organizes an independent movement. So the French, as they are defeated by Hitler, withdraw from their colony of Vietnam. That gives Ho Chi Minh a chance to pursue independence. After World War II, then, the French want to come back. And the French come back by May of 1954. Ho Chi Minh and his communist independence organization surround the French troops at Dien Bien Phu. So there's a battle of Dien Bien Phu in which the French are defeated, but because of our NATO obligations, the United States feels somewhat obligated to come in and help the French. And we also have then this policy of containment, not allowing communism to spread. And so there's a real fear that if the United States does not get involved in this Vietnam conflict, then the communism could actually spread into other regions or other areas within this region. And that was kind of known as this Domino Theory. So the question is asked, why did the United States support the French? And it's because we felt like if China had already fallen, North Korea was established, and there was a threat on South Korea. If Vietnam falls, then what's next? Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, maybe Malaysia, and on and on. So once one country falls to communism, its neighbors will soon follow. And eventually, will communism reach America? That's the question. So we valued France as an ally against communism, especially in Europe, but also then in this region of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, therefore we must fight against communism. So after then this Dien Bien Phu debacle, where the French are defeated, we have a Geneva conference in which the French, the Vietnamese are all called together, the United States is there, and some sort of a resolution to this initial conflict with France, a resolution is called for. Diem's regime is known as a very strong anti-communist. He also has some tendencies against the Buddhist nation. He is a Roman Catholic, has some education in the United States. The Diem regime had complete power, and then so this regime actually attacks some of their political enemies, and this becomes an issue. You have this NLF, this National Liberation Front, trying to oust their leader, Ngo Dinh Diem. The Viet Cong then are southern Vietnamese supporters of Ho Chi Minh, and they support then the NLF. So Viet Cong and NLF use terrorist attacks against Diem. Diem then gets stronger in his approach and attacks more his political enemies, so much so that there are some famous photographs here of some of the Buddhist monks in the South Vietnam, in the country of South Vietnam, protesting against Ngo Dinh Diem's regime by setting themselves on fire. So these are some awful images on the streets of South Vietnam. And so in America, the soldiers that are being asked to be involved in this conflict are looking at these images and saying that they're fighting for the guy or for the side that causes this. So questions are immediately asked about our involvement in Vietnam. So the initial involvement of the United States does occur both politically and also in an advisory role when Eisenhower is president. Of course, then it continues to evolve and continues to grow when Kennedy is in office. But the Vietnam conflict takes a whole new kind of center stage when Lyndon Johnson takes over for Kennedy. And so this South Vietnam government is just about as corrupt as this new South Vietnam government, after Diem is assassinated, is just as corrupt as Diem is. And the conflict between the NLF and South Vietnam continues. McNamara and Johnson decide to increase American commitment to this cause. All of this occurs, and then we have kind of the moment, the Gulf of Tonkin attack, where the USS Maddox is sailing in these waters here, and it is attacked. And there's all kinds of questions as to what actually happened in the fog of war. McNamara talks about this. But the results are that Johnson goes to Congress and asks for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, in which he can then launch a full-scale attack against North Vietnam in response to this attack on the USS Maddox. These are just a couple more images about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This is President Johnson addressing the nation, informing them that escalation of the conflict has occurred. This is the again the map of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the attack on the USS Maddox. The Maddox is sailing. It is controversially revealed that it has high-tech listening capabilities. It is actually, in fact, spying on North Vietnam, and does it in fact stray into North Vietnam waters, North Vietnamese waters? Is the USS Maddox justly attacked, or is it is it attacked at all? Regardless, because perception is that it is attacked, Johnson goes to Congress and gets authority to respond, and the response is actually Operation Rolling Thunder. It's all-out bombardment, aerial assault on North Vietnam. So here's some information here in written form. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, officially Public Law 88408, was addressed as a joint resolution to the United States Congress on August 10, 1964, in direct response to this minor naval engagement at the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It is of historical significance because it gives Johnson, authorizes Johnson without formal declaration of war by Congress, this use of military forces. And so then that leads to a rapid escalation, a very rapid escalation, U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam conflict, and that rapid escalation is Operation Rolling Thunder. And more bombs are dropped, and a lot of these are then napalm, but a lot of these bombs are conventional as well. More bombs are dropped on North Vietnam than all of Europe in World War II. So as escalation occurs in this conflict, the draft, some other very controversial things occur, but you have the Selective Service and Military Draft. 2 million Americans serve in Vietnam. 1 out of every 4 men were excused from the draft for various reasons, and these become very controversial. College deferments, health reasons, and then this odd kind of stat here, higher income men were less likely to be drafted, and so that becomes controversial. brings a lot of attention to protesters in the United States. Then another aspect of this are minorities, and minorities serving in a higher proportion than the rich. And so African Americans often did supply a disproportionate number of combat troops, a high percentage of whom had voluntarily enlisted, although they made up less than 10%. I think this is pretty key here. Less than 10% of American men in arms, about 13% of the U.S. population. They also then accounted for 20% of the combat-related deaths. So African Americans represented 1/4 of all the soldiers killed in action in Vietnam. So this becomes kind of a very interesting stat, very controversial statistic, but minorities served at a disproportional rate in Vietnam. That leads us then to kind of an interesting sidebar to Vietnam, and that's Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali and his conscientious objections to the war. So there's awfully interesting material about Cassius Clay and his failing to show up as conscientious objector status, wars against teaching of the holy book of the Quran, and so he proclaims, that's when he changes his name to Muhammad Ali. And I like this quote, and so you could read this: "I'm not going 10,000 miles to help murder and burn and kill other people." And so this became very controversial. This was on, of course, TV, was bringing this to the light, or bringing this to everybody's attention, and it just brought a lot of attention to the United States racial relations as civil rights movement is growing in the late 60s, growing to a head. And so just take a look if you're interested in the Vietnam conflict and in Muhammad Ali in particular. Other aspects of the counterculture during this time, the late 60s, and you have, of course, the music. You have not only the folk music and the protesting, but also some of the more popular rock. Of course, the Creedence Clearwater Revival, CCR, and The Fortunate Son, one of the anti-war songs of the day. These are just some more images from the time, both of minorities involved in the war, but just kind of bringing this conflict kind of right to your face. Guerrilla warfare was a big part of this war, and especially when you're fighting against the Viet Cong. And it was always difficult for the Americans to know for sure who they were fighting against, who was the enemy. A couple other things that do happen as the North Vietnamese are being bombed by Operation Rolling Thunder, they start to infiltrate South Vietnam and try to supply the Viet Cong that are being used in South Vietnam. And so this is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ho Chi Minh Trail goes into Laos and Cambodia and then branches off to supply the South Vietnamese fighters, the Viet Cong. And so this then leads to this intricate network of trails leads to the bombing with napalm and then the spraying of Agent Orange to make sure that the jungle foliage is gotten rid of so you can see the trail. But then that leads to an escalation of the conflict because you're bombing Cambodia and potentially bombing Laos. And so that becomes very controversial. And then we also have the Tet Offensive. This is at the end of Johnson's administration, just prior to his deciding not to run for re-election, and it's an all-out assault by the North Vietnamese and also by the Viet Cong against the army of South Vietnam and the United States. And this was kind of a demoralizing psychological effect on the United States because we felt like we were kind of coming to an end of this conflict, and yet all of a sudden, during a negotiated cease fire. There's an all-out assault by the enemy. So the Tet Offensive occurs, and that kind of leads to the beginning of the end, and eventually Nixon, when Nixon becomes president, is able to negotiate an end to this conflict, an end to the United States involvement in this conflict. So just leave you here with two controversial images. This one, of course, is a video as well, but this image of a Viet Cong suspect being shot by a South Vietnamese Army officer. So the United States then sees this on TV. We're fighting against him, with him. Whether or not this guy deserves it or not is not necessarily the debatable question. It's just as we're supporting this person and this army, and yet one of our fundamental principles is trial by jury, and this guy is executed just on the spot. And then we also have the controversial war against civilians that occurs, the napalm, when you have TV in the 1960s and 1970s and you have people eating dinner watching these controversial war images, it definitely tends to bring out some protesting. But this kind of concludes the PowerPoint on Vietnam. This goes along with Chapter 39 in your textbook. I know this is very short. There's so many things we could talk about with Vietnam. Hopefully, if you are interested in pursuing any of these topics, you can pursue those on your own. But just a reminder, the images within this presentation are in the public domain. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to call or email me. And that concludes the presentation of Vietnam that goes along with Chapter 39 in the American Pageant. Thank you.